Well, hello, welcome to an experiment. This is going to be a joint Doomer Optimism Homeward Bound podcast. Ashley, have you ever done this before? Have you done like what
I
do you call it, like
I
cross?
have. I've done a co-hosted podcast before, and it's interesting to be both. I mean, it's basically just a conversation, but it's to be both interviewer and interviewee at the same time, which I guess is what in human terms we call a conversation. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, that sounds like a good way to approach it. And I mean, it's really exciting to be sitting down and having this conversation when we're just a few weeks away from actually getting to meet in the flesh, in person, in
hmm
Chicago.
hmm
When I'm coming to, I can't even believe it. I'm coming to America for the first time in 15 years. It feels like this is going to be my first visit to America as a grown-up somehow.
Mm.
Because that was,
Yeah.
you
How
know
are
what
you
I mean?
feeling? How are you feeling about that?
I'm feeling excited, with a kind of appropriate shot of um, kind of nerves thrown
Mm.
into the excitement. It does have a bit of a venturing into the unknown quality. I'm so used to traveling backwards and forwards, between Sweden, where I live, and England, where I grew up, and the countries in between, and built up a lot of work in places along that familiar path over these last years. Whereas this feels, wow, I'm going to meet people who I've met in kind of windows like this, but never in person. I'm going to meet a few real heroes along the
Mm.
way as
Mm.
well.
Mm.
It's going to be an adventure.
I
It's going to be.
also think, well, we could get back into this later if you want, but I also think you've probably changed quite a lot since your last visit.
I'm sure I have. I mean, the last time I came over, I was part of an internet startup called School of Everything,
Yeah.
which I co-founded in 2006 with a remarkable gang of folks, including Mary Harrington, who I think
Oh,
you've
really?
come
Yes.
across.
Yes.
Right. So, if you've read Mary's Feminism Against Progress, early on, she tells the fairly grim story of the experience that she had being caught up in this internet startup, which I can testify to. And I was one of the other co-founders, and I had a much gentler ride than Mary did from it. But
I'm featured in that book at the end of it as like an
okay,
example, like, of someone not neo-traditional, but just, ways of navigating married life and,
right.
woman's, role and what all that kind of thing is. So that's so funny. We keep finding all of these points of connection between the two of us. It's amazing.
It's so funny. So a couple of years ago, when Mary started to really get the profile that she has these days as a thinker and a writer, and kind of provocateur, but a very sincere provocateur, I would say. Um, there was this conversation between her and Paul Kingsnorth, who I
hmm
started Mountain with. And Paul said to me that sort of Mary's opening line to him when they were put in touch and were going to be meeting up to do this. She said, "Well, we've got one thing in common. We've both written manifestos with Diggle Tyne. I should dig out the manifesto that Mary and I wrote in our 20s and
I
see which
love
bit
it.
of it either of us might still stand by, despite all of the changes along the way."
Yeah, right. And this is actually a good segue because my parallel experience with you coming to the US is just last October. I was at a part of organizing in a similar kind of event to the one we'll be organizing and discussing with Paul Kingsnorth,
Hmm.
your co-conspirator for the Dark Mountain Project. And he had also not been to the US in a long time. And the last time he had come to the US, he kind of had this, Mick world globalization, the US as hegemonic power, like, attitude toward the US. And then we had this little event, and, all of us at the event are just kind of wrestling with what, like, America is now and what an America could be that we could get behind and that kind of thing. And he was just so surprised by it and kind of grappling at things like Emerson, Thoreau, John Muir, Edward Abbey America, like this other strain of America that exists that kind of maybe is like underneath the surface a little bit, but maybe coming back out in our various conversations with these different groups. So that was really satisfying as an American to witness somebody
Yeah.
like Paul, who hadn't been in the US for a long time, and then he's sort of like experiencing it anew, you know, and updating his priors in real time. It was really fun to watch. So I'll get to do some of that in Chicago with you.
Definitely. So Ashley, I'm going to ask you what is kind of the opening question for the Homeward Bound podcast that I'm bringing to all of the guests who I speak to, which is just tell me a bit about where you call home.
This is this is such a rich question for me in particular, because I've been on this crazy personal journey just recently, I mean, in my life, but I'm from Chicago. My husband's from Chicago. We have a quite robust network of community members and family members in Chicago. But despite all that, I was very, I guess, doom-pilled about 12, 15 years ago, trying to think about where I wanted to settle and reading too much sociology and too much, you know, I guess like focusing on social problems, that we decided like I cannot live in Chicago. I can't raise my family here. It's just there's too many social problems. We need to go somewhere that's more stable. So I moved with my husband to Uruguay for 7 years. And then we reached a point at which we sort of said, I think we have to go home, which is our home, Chicago, and now we're back after 6 months. And I guess I would just briefly say, to not take too much time on this, I think we're really re-embracing this home place for us through new eyes that are totally new only because we had this wonderful experience abroad. Everything was, you know, lovely. The people were so welcoming. The landscape was wonderful. We learned how to, you know, be on a homestead and 9 acres and out of the city and very idyllic. But my home here is sort of my people, my culture, the place that I know, all the people I've known my whole life. And I think we kind of didn't realize the wealth that we had in to put it in sociological terms, in terms of like human capital or social capital. And now I'm just really re-embracing the whole thing. And my husband took a job at the local Catholic school, and, you know, everybody knows everybody. It's like this world's biggest small town. You know, there's these names of people, families who have been, you know, friends through the generations. Oh, do you know the McNultys? Do you know the Murphys? It's a very Irish community. My husband's Fitzgerald. And so, yeah, and my new kind of mission is basically embracing home with new eyes, with fresh eyes, and with like a less, I guess, either cynical, but I also use this term spreadsheet brain, this spreadsheet mentality, like places have to mark off some set of criteria on a list versus like the whole intuitive package with warts and all, you know.
Yeah.
And these kind of this qualitative versus quantitative is like a tension that I've been always dealing with in my life and work.
This is really striking a chord with me. I remember when I moved to Sweden 13 years ago, because obviously, like, I come from England. You can hear it in my voice. You maybe can't hear that I come from the northeast of England because I didn't carry that much of the accent with me. But I came to Sweden, and there were people both here and elsewhere who knew my work, knew about Dark Mountain, knew that I'd been part of this thing called the Institute for Collapsonomics in London with Vinay Gupta and various other crazy characters. And so people would be like, you moved to Sweden, so you've decided that's the best place to ride out the collapse.
Right.
And I was like, no, I moved to Sweden for the oldest reason in the book. I met a girl, I fell in love. And then you hit that place where you're choosing between, you know, where one of you comes from or where the other of you comes from. And it was really clear to us. And that's, you know, that's even before we got to the stage of starting a family, but it was just really clear to us that we needed to make a home somewhere that was home turf to one or the other of us. You know, so long as that option was available, and for all kinds of reasons, not least that, you know, Anna's parents still live in the house that they moved into when she was 6 years old, whereas
Mm.
my dad was a church minister. We moved around every few years, so there was no place that was home in the same way. And yeah, we live like an hour away from, just over an hour away from where Anna's parents live. We live in a small place, population of about 1,500. We've been here for 3 years. We're very, very early in the process of grafting ourselves into a small community that is made up both of families that have been around forever and of people who've arrived recently enough that we don't just feel like we stick out like a sore
Mm.
thumb.
Mhm.
But I also think, hearing you tell that story about coming back to Chicago, I'm going to be really interested, to talk more about that when we see each other in Chicago, but also to follow that journey, because I find it very important that we have stories and examples that aren't all about, finding your homestead out in the sticks. And we had Elizabeth Oldfield and her family here visiting a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, I love her so much. I have her book. I can't wait to read it. It's in the
Have
list.
you have you had her on the podcast yet?
No, I want to read the book first and then have her
Yeah.
on. But man, she is just what a kindred spirit. Oh,
Yeah, completely. And I always say to her, it means so much to me to be able to point to an example in the middle of London of a little community of radical hospitality that is exploring so many of the same things that you are talking to people about with Zoomer optimism, that we're working on with a school called Home. But it's really important to have these counter examples that say it's not all about a green wave where we all move out to the countryside. Yeah, there's going to be, like in the best case, we're headed towards the kind of small farm future that I talked to you and
look,
Chris Mage
look.
about. Yeah, there you got it in the
It's
background.
got such a nice cover and so easy to see, so I just put it there in the back.
Great cover, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. And it's the same, the same publisher. We're both with Chelsea Green. They do, as I have to say. And yeah, very grateful to Chelsea Green for rolling with this wild idea of me coming over and doing this big, busy tour where I'm going to be on the road for like 2 weeks, basically non-stop. The closest
Yeah.
thing to a stop is what we're doing this weekend residential kind of gathering in Chicago.
Yeah.
So
Should we discuss it?
yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I guess to start, I can talk a little bit about this event with Paul. And I just had a podcast. It's the one right previous to this one, but this one will come after, with Paul McNeil, who runs an a place called the Wagon Box in Wyoming. And he's thinking of this place as a kind of campus, where people can come. They'll have like, a weekend retreat, an event, maybe a series of classes. They have a library there and a restaurant and places to stay. And so people will just sit, and it's in between things where people will have conversations. And it's kind of like a stopping point for people who are kind of, I don't know, I guess all around the edges of society, looking for their fellow people. And I had been wanting to do an event of, just kind of similar thinkers, but I also have a kind of really strong aversion to being too legible or too clear about who is in and who is out, because I don't like that purity politics type stuff. So it's just sort of like, oh, doomer optimism, people who are interested in these kinds of not just environmentalism, but questions about how to live well and, against the machine. Paul was coming to the United States anyways for a Front Porch Republic talk, Paul Kingsnorth. And Paul McNeil has this great event space. And so we sort of brought the two together, and just as a kind of experimental, intuitive event, like, let's just see what happens and how it was with all the people together. And I found it really, really meaningful to just kind of get people in the same space, but also to do a kind of event that isn't, I guess, too planned, too organized, too corporate, too much in a hotel,
Yes.
conference room, air-conditioned setting, and, where it just feels so informal, but instead to make it really small and very alive, and everybody has to participate and everybody has to talk to one another, and there's no way to hide in the corner. And so basically, you know, we sort of developed that event, and I thought it was really wonderful. And so then Dugald was telling me, hey, look, I'm coming to the US, you know, for this book tour. I know that you did something similar with Paul. Maybe we could do a sort of weekend event, retreat kind of thing. And I thought, wow, what a great idea. I would love to do something like that. I'm already based in Chicago. Chicago is sort of the middle of the US, relatively easy to get to, less much easier to get to than Wyoming. And so yeah, so we thought we kind of are starting to co-develop this event with the idea being, you know, sort of a weekend long retreat where we have Dugald in residence. We can sort of have an ongoing conversation about the book, but I also think it's really important to have attendees co-create. And so I have a whole other podcast with my friend Rich Bartlett, who's actually really close with Elizabeth
Yeah,
Oldfield.
no, he's how I met Elizabeth
Oh,
Oldfield.
oh, oh, you
So,
know Rich.
yeah, I know Rich.
Oh my
Yes.
God, that's so funny. I had no idea. Yeah, Rich is wonderful. And I went to one of his events in Colorado, his like first American micro
Right.
solidarity event, and kind of learned his process, his touch on co-creating. It's like managing people, but it's sort of like drawing people out and saying, hey, you know, you're as equal and interesting part of this event as anyone else. What do you have to contribute? And then just kind of seeing how it all meshes together and people make connections in a way that's surprising and really fun, as opposed to like maybe a conference, you've got a series of talks, they're predetermined, you know what they're going to be. You try to put people together by theme, and people, you know, it's just so it feels more cold, less
Yeah,
alive. And
and I
so
think that alive is the word because I've been through various iterations of this over the years because even back when I was in the kind of startup world, and I mean School of Everything was a weird startup because it was inspired by the next to last chapter of Illich's Deschooling Society, trying to put that into
but
practice in the
not
middle of
quite, yeah,
London.
Silicon Valley ethos.
But we got tangled up with all of the all of that weird stuff, including Silicon Valley, including the kind of center left policy think tank world. It was a weird, messy story. But back in those days, already people were going like, the way we did conferences is rubbish. We need to find a way of turning it inside out. But then you get like really helpful stuff that comes from places like the art of hosting. But unless you're holding it gently and with an attention to the bit that can't be written down, the
Mm,
risk is because of the machine culture we're coming out of, it devolves into a process where people believe in the process. And if you use the process and follow step one, step two, step three, step four, then the
mhm,
magic of a non-hierarchical event will happen. Whereas actually the magic that you're looking for requires that kind of care and attention to following where the life is, to attending to
mhm.
the specific, to the actual relationships and people and different gifts that are being brought to the table, which is what someone like Rich Bartlett is
Oh,
wonderful.
he's a genius at it. Yeah, and this
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. At the Wagon Box event, the last one. You know, we were sort of going along. We had a schedule, and it was sort of, you know, sketched out. But then people kept coming up and saying like, "Well, I could talk about this, or I could talk about that." And there was a point at which it was clear that many of the speakers it was male dominated speaker set, and then we had a whole group of women who were sort of present as the wives of the speakers. And so then we decided to do a whole session where it was just all the women coming up and sort of talking about their, you know, it was Paul Kingsnorth's wife and
Now,
Peter
yeah.
Allen. Yeah, she's amazing. And it's like, yeah, Paul Kingsnorth gets to talk at everything, but she is so interesting and so educated and has so many interesting ideas. And so it was like, all right, let's do it. Let's just take this session and make it all put 5 women up there and let them talk to each other. So that kind of thing where you're paying attention to, you know, you could have too many sort of galaxy brain policy people, and then you want to bring out like the farmer and the trucker and the we had a kind of like Andy Hickman, he's like a nomadic writer guy. And
Mm.
so, you know, Train Hopper was a radical anarchist back in the day. Like, you know, you've got to just be constantly curating and intuitive about these things. And it's not it's very tiring as the event coordinator, as Rich said, but it's really fun for attendees, and you're surprising, I guess.
And, in the end, it's the most satisfying way to have convened something,
Right.
even though it takes more out of you than something more kind of standard issue, doing it by the book does. You, there is, there's an energy in the long run that comes from knowing that you've attended to the unexpected possibilities that showed up and not just what you wanted to happen.
Right, right. And not planning, I think I would say it from the point of the attendees too, it takes a little bit of a leap of faith. Like, if you're going to an academic conference, whether you're talking or not, you've got the prepared slides, you know what you're talking on, you're glad when your talk is over. And as an attendee, you're just sort of sitting back and, receiving the information and maybe integrating it a little bit, forgetting it as soon as you walk out of the room. But instead to think about even format ways where you're kind of pushing people. And as an attendee, you will be a little bit challenged, but it's very satisfying to, you're not going to push anybody to do anything they don't feel comfortable doing, but you set forth an invitation like, hey, this is your chance to use your creativity to get up in front of a group to see where their points of convergence. And I think it's really satisfying in the end, even if it's a little scary at first. Even going to Rich's event, I was thinking, I'm a very extroverted person, very used to talking in front of people, but like, what's going to happen here? This is so exciting kind of, but also nerve-wracking as an attendee.
Yeah. So I was thinking as you were speaking about that, and as you were kind of mentioning the contrast with the academic conference, I have managed to minimize the number of academic conferences I have attended in my life. I'm very lucky. I found a way to, follow a life of letters and of ideas outside of institutions from very early on. But I have a particular memory of a summer. It must have been, I guess, maybe 2010 or 2011, where I went to two gatherings in a row. And the second gathering was an academic conference. It was in the Netherlands. It was basically, I think the majority of the participants were, to a greater or lesser extent, eco-Marxists within academia. Many of them were kind of outliers within their home departments. So this gathering was the one moment of the year where they got together with people who they didn't have to, just have a sort of epistemological
Guard themselves, right?
in
Yeah.
order to even do anything. They could start from some shared assumptions. And then there was a sort of admixture of Illichians, which is how I came to be there, because my friend Dean Bavington, who's an environmental historian who was supervised by Sajay Samuel, who is he was one of Illich's closest pupils and friends in the last years of his life. They had kind of taken me along for the ride. But for me, the experience was completely different to most of the people there, because I just spent 5 days with this smaller group of friends and co-conspirators of Ivan Illich in a convent in Italy, where they were practicing the ways of gathering which they learned from working with him. And so
Wow.
morning we would sit around the table in the garden at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it would be a different person within the group's role to start off a conversation. There was no kind of reading of prepared papers. There had been some things circulated in advance, but we were taking turns to guide an inquiry, being supported by some of the people who had worked with Illich and really had this in their bones. And then the same thing would happen at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'd sit for sort of 3 hours then. And going from that true conviviality, that way of gathering where, one of the things they say about Illich and his circle is, whenever you sat down to eat together, there would always be an extra place at the table and a candle lit stood on the table, waiting for the stranger who might arrive at your door. I saw that again being with those who are still around and with the new generations of people who've been drawn into that circle at a gathering in Germany earlier this summer. And as I witnessed it, I suddenly realized that back in 2007, the first time I met any of them, when I traveled to Cuernavaca for this colloquium that I'd found out about at 2 weeks' notice that was happening on the anniversary of Illich's death. I was the stranger who was
Mm,
welcomed in and offered the extra seat at the table then and
I love it.
taken into that company. And I realized that actually it takes someone has to put themselves in the role of vulnerability of being the stranger who shows up not knowing anyone
I
in order
love
for the dance of hospitality to begin.
it.
That's one of the
Yes.
things that I learned from that
I
company.
love that so much. I love that. It actually reminds me of something a similar social technology I came across. Maybe it was 5 years ago or something, I've been in and out of various academic kind of circles. I'm probably similar to you, although I have probably been roped into more academic conferences than you, but due to various, work obligations, whatever. At one gathering, I suggested we do something called a Jeffersonian dinner, which was developed by Thomas Jefferson. And I'll just tell you briefly what it involves. You have to have one table, you can't have more than one, 8 to 14 guests. You can't have less than 8 or more than 14. You have to have some kind of topic that the host brings up, something to start with, like kind of how you said at the Illichian table, somebody's leading the conversation. You have to eat, you have to be eating together. Obviously, it's a dinner. Everybody who comes has to come with a list of 5 to 7 questions they might pose to deepen the conversation as it progresses. You start by everybody sort of sharing your story. So each person shares a personal reflection. It kind of, deepens the sort of understanding of who we're sitting at the table with. Let the conversation go as the passion goes, as the interest goes. As the host, you make sure all the participants feel welcome and have a chance to talk. So Rich Bartlett is a genius at this. Like, there's some people who are just so excited and they're, sort of hogging the floor. And then he'll say, he'll call on someone and say, ask something specific, but not difficult to answer, to give a person a chance to sort of like break their internal ice of, speaking in front of everybody. And then give your guests the opportunity to share something they learned at the end of the evening, maybe an idea that was inspiring or something they plan to follow up on or something that really resonated with them. I loved this, and I've only done it once ever, but maybe we can do something like this kind of format or the format you
Yeah,
suggested.
we could do that on the Saturday evening, maybe at
Right.
Chicago. I'd like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that would be wonderful. But I love that somebody, centuries ago has already been thinking about this kind of like structure for conviviality. And we seem to keep reinventing these things as like basic human ways to interact with one another to feel safe, but also to be very super engaged, and I think there's a tendency, if you don't curate it well, to kind of fall into old patterns. So I talked to Rich Bartlett about this a little bit, like, what do people do if there's no guidance at all? They'll say, okay, it's time to break for lunch, and maybe like 1 or 2 people might coordinate with someone else to go out to lunch together, or people might eat on their own. And if you suggest like, hey, why don't take it or leave it, but you could do X, Y, or Z during the lunch hour. Just those little bits of suggestion and curation can help knock people out of their safer patterns, of socializing.
Yeah. So one of the challenges, I think, is how we make invitations to this kind of work.
Mm.
You know, we partly because we live in a world where you're always meant to be selling yourself. And you're always meant to, have that list of the 3 deliverables that you're going to acquire through taking part in this course, or, whatever it is, but you're meant to have the elevator pitch for your book, your project, etc. And, there's a kernel of truth in some of those things. But a lot of the work that feels like it matters most and has most life in it for me just now refuses to put itself into neat, legible categories, to use that word that you used earlier. And I think that applies equally to, the kind of legibility of the positions on the map of the sides, the ways that lines are drawn up in the world just now. And that's one of the things that I was trying to do with the book, is to kind of defuse some of the kind of panic and polarization that characterizes the way that we talk about the trouble that the world is undoubtedly in. And like, I don't think that this is a problem that has a solution or needs to be thought of as a problem. I think it's just actually part of the challenge of doing the kind of work that you're doing and that I'm doing, that we speak more quietly than the voices that consume the most oxygen, the most attention in the public space. And that quietness is in itself part of the gift. It's part of what makes the rooms in which unexpected things can happen, creates the encounters that don't fit onto existing map. But it is an interesting thing to just, to name as part of the challenge. And I think I'm experiencing that, particularly making this journey to North America, parts of North America anyway, east of the Mississippi, from Washington on upwards. It's a limited part of your side of the world that I'm coming to visit on this trip, but I'm aware that there are quite rich, long-built networks around my work in the countries where I spend my time normally. And here I'm coming instead into a context where there are a lot of people who I've had contact with, where it's very exciting for us to be actually on the same piece of land. But there's also, I don't know how to do this. I don't know quite how to reach out and make those invitations in the same ways that kind of come as second nature to me at home.
Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, what your various hosts, including myself on your trip, will help integrate that a little bit. I think that was part of what I was trying to do with Paul when he came. I remember when he first came, we arrived all together at this Front Porch Republic conference in Madison, Wisconsin. And I kind of realized, because Paul McNeil at the Wagon Box was the one communicating with Paul Kingsnorth, that he didn't really tell him a lot in advance. And so I was realizing, like, Paul Kingsnorth has no idea where he's going or who he's going to be with. And I should try to at least like bridge this gap a little bit. And I think like that night I sent him an email with like a bunch of links to people's writing, so he at least knew like we weren't complete psychopaths, but he, Paul McNeil was vouched through the Front Porch Republic people who he knows closely. But yeah, Paul Kingsnorth, I think, was also making a similar leap of faith, sort of, I'm gonna just put myself out there, and see people know me, but I don't really know them. People know my work, but I'm not steeped in this like American, this sub scene of all these different kinds of writers and people thinking on these topics, like, much more obviously what's happening in Europe. There's a kind of, it's a little bit intimidating, but it's also really fun to see where it goes. One anecdote I'll share is we have these policy type guys, they're either in academia influencing policy or in sort of think tank work, who like work in DC, who are at this event, and they're very conservation minded, but I think from more of a conservative point of view. So we're sitting here talking about like land management and pollution and this kind of stuff, and Paul Kingsnorth raises his hand and says, it's so heartwarming to see these conservative environmental thinkers catching up to the green movement of the 70s. And it was just such a perfect like moment where he's kind of poking fun at this, subculture that's forming, but we're all kind of like self-aware that the environmental movement in its various forms is not really like launched that much since beyond the 70s, like, concern with pollution. I'll say a couple other things relative to your point. There's this Chris Rock, I think it was, made this point at one point. In America, you're not talking to a person, you're talking to their agent. I don't know how true that is in Europe too, but it's definitely true in the US, where like as soon as you get into a conversation, especially if you're in a city or at any kind of like high-powered networking event, you're like, elevator pitch, who are you? How can I say something that's most impressive? How can I make sure I say the right words to signal I'm in your group? You know, I'm in the in group. And so to me, like there's nothing more harmful to open and sincere conversation than that kind of like approach to start with. And so I love small talk, but like sincere small talk, not, you know, this agent selling yourself small talk. So I think, yeah, part of what I've been trying to do with Doomer Optimism in general, and then, you know, this event and hopefully our upcoming event, is to kind of do exactly what you said, like decrease the panic and polarization that happens with this. Rich Bartlett talks about this a lot. You've got a pluralistic group coming together that are all coming around some shared maybe set of themes, but maybe from different angles. And to make it so that, you know, you're sort of just bringing forth the human side of things to make people feel comfortable. I think to be a little bit irreverent, to have fun, you know, to show that it's, you know, it's about enjoyment and not necessarily about, you know, getting some deliverables like you were saying. You know, at the Wagon Box event, I remember waking up and having coffee. It was snowing, and they have a creek that runs through the property. And every morning there was a suggestion, 8 a.m., there's a dip in the creek. It's freezing cold. So I'd be having my coffee and I'd see like 7 guys running out in their like suits or underwear, jumping and then running across the snow. I'm like, you know, just fun and a little bit of irreverence and a little bit of fun, I think it goes such a long way to just, you can make jokes, you can see the human in one another, and not in like such a overly self-conscious sentimental way, but just you know, in the way that we're all used to being invited in as the stranger at the table. What would you do to make a stranger feel comfortable? Ask them a bit about themselves, make a little joke, you know, kind of see the human in one another, you know?
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it, Ashley. I'm looking forward to the whole thing. It's going to be, you know, it's so interesting that you talking about Paul talking about the 70s environmentalism and so on. I'm going to be starting off at the Schumacher Center
Mm-hmm.
in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where Bayo Kamalafe is currently there as a thinker in residence. And Bayo and I met in Paris in 2018 together with Vanessa Andreotti, and the three of us were hanging out around the edges of this
Mm-hmm.
conference we didn't really feel at home at. So we sort of got to know each other through, yeah, through the margins of the conference where all the good stuff happens.
Right.
And ever since then, we've kind of kept in touch and tried to find a way to be like in the same place at the same time. And finally, it became clear that it was going to work. So
Mm.
that's going to be like the opening night of the thing. And then later on the tour, when I get to Boston, I'm doing an event with Lewis Hyde, who
Mm.
wrote The Gift and Trickster Makes This World, and these books that had massive impact on me. And one of the things that people, even if they've read Lewis's books, don't necessarily know is that Illich was really important for him. At the
Mm.
back of The Gift, at the beginning of the acknowledgements, it says this book started from a month of conversations that I had in Cuernavaca, Mexico, at the Center for Intercultural Documentation in the early 70s. Thank you to Ivan Illich and all who were part of the milieu that he created there.
Mm.
So, and then going to end up at the peasantry school the peasantry school is in upstate New York near Keysville. We're actually going to do an event across the lake in Burlington, Vermont,
Mm.
but with Adam Wilson, who, if people don't know, anyone who's following Doomer Optimism, if you don't know already, then I heartily recommend the Peasantry School Substack that Adam writes. And you know, he's really living on this wild edge of, this isn't quite the language he uses, but it's how it seems to me. He's living under a vow. And his
Mm.
vow is that he's going to be a farmer. He's going to farm this piece of land, and none of the food that is grown there, none of the animals from that farm, none of their meat is going to be sold for money. And
Mm.
therefore, in order to make good on that, he has to do the work of, you know, recovering and reinventing practices of community.
Mm.
that allow you to be in good enough relationship with the place you're in that you're feeding people without it having to pass through the market economy. And he's really putting that into practice week in, week out. So I'm so excited. And when we started planning the event with Lewis Hyde, which is it's going to be at the School of Theology at Boston University, I suddenly had this idea, which I thought was just the title for that event. And it's The Gifts in the Ruins.
Mm.
And then when I was talking to Adam and his friend Sam about the event we're going up there to do, I saw in their eyes when I mentioned that title, they were just like, "Ah, yeah, that name's something that people are longing for."
Mm-hmm.
And I've gradually realized that maybe that's more like the theme of the whole tour. Maybe that's also the theme of the
Our
the
event.
gathering we're holding in Chicago, The Gifts in the Ruins.
Mm-hmm. I
As you
love
know,
that.
2 or 3 years on from writing the book, having already spent a year and a half taking it out into the world, coming back to it now and rereading it, I'm realizing the place where I've traveled further is that more and more of my attention is being called to the gifts and to what it looks like to step off the edge of the map of the stuff you're meant to take seriously if you want to be taken seriously. Because increasingly I just believe that that's where what's called for now comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Read a great post on Substack earlier today from Ellie Robbins that's called "This Moment Needs Your Deep Weirdness and Your Intellectual Rigor." And I love that pairing and the naming that's going on there. And it's like, yeah, that's it. Stepping into the space of things that don't make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending, that don't fit onto its maps, including its political maps, with some faith that in the journey that takes us on, there are gifts that we can't see, gifts that don't make sense. Lydia Catterall, the artist, once said to me, I've realized that there can be a gift in something you could never have asked for. It's what I feel every time I read Nick Cave writing in the Red Hand Files. Like he's reshaped his whole life around the horror of his son's death and the opening that created for him into a kind of faith and a kind of vulnerability and beauty in his work that is kind of true to everything he'd been doing before, but takes it somewhere further. And it's that thing of, that's what we're looking for. If we've been looking, doom in the eye, collapse in the eye, whatever the language we use for it is, as Paul and I were doing when we invited people to Dark Mountain in the first place in 2009. Yep. It's, in with that come gifts which don't cancel out the loss and the disorientation and the grief, but maybe help us start redrawing the maps or navigating the humbler kind of map than the ones that we were schooled to be looking for.
Yes. Okay. Two things I have to say to this. One is my pinned tweet. I just tweeted, this is a couple months ago, but I rediscovered a New York Times article about Dark Mountain and you and Paul, and it was, highlighting the, interviewing Paul, and he had a quote in there, and I was like, this is so frustrating on the one hand, because this was written, 10 years ago, and he's already like articulating this thing that I think I'm like making up, but I'm not. And you guys have been working on it forever, but that's okay. That's how all of scholarship is. It's like,
yeah, we didn't make it up either. We just found a particular way of saying it.
We're just, continuing to iterate into the modern world on, ideas that existed before you. But the quote is, "I'm increasingly attracted by the idea that there can be at least small pockets where life and character and beauty and meaning continue. If I could help protect one of those from destruction, maybe that would be enough. Maybe it would be more than most people do." I love that. I'm like, have shivers saying it. And then another thing, bringing back to something you talked about earlier, which is, Elizabeth's work, my work, like the diversity of how that can look is so wild and so important to showcase. And I think I'll highlight that our retreat in Chicago is the only sort of long form discussion you have planned. You have, like one-off, book events and, talks, but this Chicago event is meant to be like a longer form discussion with your readers and Doomer Optimism listeners and the kinds of people who want to sort of grapple with some of these things in more depth. I think a lot of times on these short whatever events, talks, you kind of just get to the point at which you say, and then there's all these different things we should explore, but not enough time to actually sit down and explore some of those examples. And people are always asking, like, what are the examples? What can I look to? And so I think it would be really, really fruitful if, as we develop this co-created event, having people come with a sort of diversity of examples, a diversity of gifts in the ruins that they're exploring, that they're looking to. And for me, in Chicago, for example, it's like night and day, my view of my own home influenced by like my doomer mindset or not. And my own ability to see like the gifts of my own home was impossible 10 years ago. And now it's really about like, how can you make in your own front yard like a permacultural ecosystem? You can, and you can teach other people about it, and a lot of people are doing it. How can you make communal living, and it's just neighbor kids running around together and always ringing your doorbell, and they're going to be eating over at the neighbor's house and they're eating over here, and we're taking care of one another, and it's not this like self-conscious commune, it's just a neighborhood, it's just families working together. So talking about these diverse forms of gifts of beauty that exists out there, I think can be really inspiring for people and what they really want more of. But then I think there's a lot of contradictions with it too. So working out the challenges, the contradictions, how do you navigate the tensions between ideological tribes in your community, and the practicalities of it. Well, here's what I did, here's what I did. One model I think about a lot when I think about just like sharing social technology is back when I was a very new mother, I went to this thing called the La Leche League. I haven't been there, or I don't know if they have meetings anymore post-COVID or what. But what the meetings were like at the time was basically everybody is relatively new to breastfeeding or has young kids and they're like a few years into breastfeeding. And so it was kind of like a group of women sitting together who have the whole bell curve of human experience. And then you ask a question like, how do you do X, Y, and Z? And then you get 10 answers. They're all a little different from each other, of people who have practically tried to work through those challenges in the modern world. And then you can kind of integrate all that advice in a way that works for you then. And so I love that kind of model where it's like, there's not one answer. It's not like you said, it's not just go find a homestead and some land and get out of society or whatever, but instead there's a diverse range of answers. You can integrate all of those and then make it work in your own life with your own limitations and goals and parameters and challenges, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love that. I would love if one of the things that I come away from this time together in Chicago with is, new leads, new clues. I can share some of the stories of some of the projects that I've seen growing in the networks around a school called Home, which is very international. We convene things online, and so we have people in all corners of the world, really, and some people who've been involved for a number of years, or people who were deep in their own projects, that they recognized some commonality with what we were talking about and therefore got involved. So I will be bringing stories and examples to share, but I'm also really looking forward to that chance, as you say, to kind of to go deep together, to get tangled up with each other, to get your stories and experience and ideas entangled with the ones that I'm bringing, and see what happens for us all in that expansiveness of actually having a couple of days in an unhurried, gently, attentively held space. So yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. anything else we want to, I guess the dates, I mean, it's September 14th and 15th in Chicago.
Yes.
We'll be both adding a little link to this podcast episode. This Dugald was supposed to come later in the fall, and then it got moved up. So we're kind of, hurried in organizing all of these things and doing our best to make it happen. But
It's it's all coming together one way and another, isn't it?
Yeah. And in the way it has to be, in the conversation with Paul McNeil of the Wagon Box, he was kind of like, it's just self-selecting people who will find their way out to Wyoming. And I think it's similarly, people who might listen to something like this and take a leap of faith that they, could get something of great substance out of such a meeting. And in my opinion, of course, it's my interest area, but in my opinion, these kinds of conversations, I just don't really see this kind of event, kind of conversations happening very often. And I just feel like I feel so lucky to be a part of them, to be helping organize and curate. But like, I really feel like, I mean, I don't want to put it in Silicon Valley terms, but like cutting edge, if you're really interested on like the bleeding edge of where we're going, how to move forward, like how to break through all of the gridlock that it feels like in various, scenes and ideological like lines that are drawn. I don't know of any similar kinds of events where that's really the goal, is to try to think through these questions, which I think are like the most important and pressing questions, just on a day-to-day basis, not even necessarily like work or advancement or anything like that, but more, how do we live our lives in this time?
And I bet you get what I've heard a lot over the years with Dark Mountain and with the school, people expressing relief.
Yeah, right. Yes.
They come into these spaces and almost that kind of audible kind of breathing out, being able to step into a room full of people where you don't feel kind of like you're needing to hold some defenses in order to show up.
Yes.
Room to bring more of yourself. There's room to bring more of yourself to these spaces than it would be wise to bring to many of the spaces that are on offer in society.
Right. Right. It is, and I get that all the time, even just from the podcast, just having virtual conversations with people are saying, I'm just so glad you exist. I get messages all the time. I'm just so glad I found you, because, maybe there's a podcast that cares more about, climate catastrophe, but then it's just constantly catastrophizing, and that doesn't feel right. And then there's ones that are just about politics, and then you're just on this dopamine ride of politics, and the ones that are just, we're on the in-group and we're only going to talk about in-group things, and nobody else is invited into the table unless you have this pure ideological set of principles. That also feels, I don't know, not welcoming, not generative. So yeah, I get a lot of messages like that. And I think during the pandemic, it was wonderful to have these virtual conversations. But now there's so much joy in bringing the conversations to life in person. There's just nothing like it. I mean, I think Illich said something about you seeing the whites of your eyes. Like, you just have to be able to, it's just being in person with people and laughing together, and the little moments in between. There's just nothing like it. I think it's just the human connection. Everybody craves it nowadays,
Yeah. It's, that moment of seeing yourself reflected in the eyes of the other, and that's in that it's I thou, not it's it's all these little pockets out of which who knows what's
I mean, I'll just say that in the event with Paul, many friendships were formed that I think are really, kind of important substantive friendships. I know a lot of my friends who are there, have various projects, and it's not that the whole point is to make some sort of career advancement, but it was like finding somebody else whose project is adjacent to yours, and knowing you're not alone, and sort of sharing insights together. And, I wrote this piece, can you read it for me? And people are constantly still sharing their information with one another and supporting one another. And like, I just love, there's a sociological term, I'm, verging into spreadsheet brain, but the strength of weak ties.
Oh yeah.
There's just these ties you make with people, and like the ties you made at this other conference, and now you're bringing them back together after all these years. Like these things kind of persist through time, and there's these network effects that sort of build when you take the leap, and it's not just passive consumption of content, but instead the active creation of relationship, and actually getting into the arena in that way. I think it's really
Yeah,
wonderful.
it's how we create. I mean, on the one hand, what Brian Eno calls scenius, the collective genius of scenes, the
Mm,
special quality of those relatively small scale webs of relationship that create the pockets within which people do things that they wouldn't have achieved on their own. We become capable of more through creating these trusted pockets of relationship, and the pockets within which, unlike most of the praise and most of the criticism you get in your life, the praise actually matters and means something, and the criticism is actually helpful rather than loaded with someone else's baggage. And
right.
that's what's born out of these kinds of ways of gathering. And at the other, like more serious end of it, I think of something that Elizabeth Oldfield spoke about in our first online Homeward Bound course that we did with a school called Home. And she spoke, I remember, in the first session about Bonhoeffer and about one of his friends speaking about the weak centers of resistance, the importance of these kind of domestic scale pockets within which, in that nightmare of history that Bonhoeffer and so many others were living through the middle of, that it was in these pockets that looked too small to be worth taking seriously.
Mm,
Light and hope and faith and the possibility that we are capable of something else were
mhm,
kept alive.
mhm.
And it's not to place our context in any way as parallel to that, but it is to recognize that in all times and places, there is a kind of disproportionate importance to the pockets within which it's possible to attend to the things that are going missing from official reality of one kind or another.
Oh, I love that so much. And I'll just add one thing, which is, I think a lot of times, for example, when we're talking about these various conversations on doom or optimism, the explorations, experimentations people are doing, a lot of people will say, well, this won't scale, or this isn't making any major impact on the culture. And my answer to that is I don't care. I don't care. Like, I don't care that if everybody does it. I just care that it's a viable thing in these pockets. It's possible. And that, you're keeping some form of hope alive in one way or another. And it doesn't matter to me if 51% of the population does it, or 2% of the population. 2% of the population is a lot of the population, and it's just as long as you have some people to share in that with, that's the most important thing, I would say. And so, it's really just a economics thing to ask these questions. Does it scale? Does it scale? I love these little pockets. I love that they're existing. I love curating them. And I don't think it's a failure to continue curating these kinds of relationships if they're not the mainstream. It's okay that they're not the mainstream. Maybe they never will be. Maybe that's not the goal anyways.
Yeah, there are other ways of having consequences.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, this was such a nice conversation. I'm so glad we got to talk long form and get everybody a little glimpse into this retreat. I hope anyone who is available, I know it's relatively short notice, only a few weeks away, but please come. I think it'll be very enjoyable. I'm excited to see how it turns out. It will be created by the people who sign up, and so we'll see, what mix we get together. I'm sure anyone who's drawn to doomer optimism and to Dougal's work will have, some sort of shared sense of what we're trying to curate, especially through this conversation. You'll see that. But any final words from you,
Well,
Dougal?
I just want to say, Ashley, thank you for having me on Doomer Optimism, and thank you for coming on Homeward Bound. And How efficient and effective of us to
I
manage to
know, I
podcast
know, I
in one.
know. Everybody should just both have a podcast, every guest and host. Okay, well, yeah. So reach out to me if anyone has any questions. My contact information is going to be in the event description, but any questions, concerns, I can try to clear up, but otherwise, anyone who can make it, we'll see you in Chicago.
Yeah, see you in Chicago.